You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. So listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.
The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome to another set of older member episodes that are being released here on the main episode feed. This series of episodes covers the interwar Royal Navy, which seemed appropriate as the podcast is about to start its episodes on the Battle of Britain. In fact, that's what I'm working on right now, which is why you're hearing this. There will be 6 episodes in total released over the next 6 weeks as I get this next series on the Battle of Britain kind of sorted out, prepared, and ready for release. Thank you for your patience, and here's the episode. Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, Members Episode 13, The Royal Navy Part 3, The End of the Naval Treaties. Last episode we discussed some of the problems faced by the Royal Navy in the early and mid-1930s, as the threats that they faced in Europe continued to grow. The entire treaty structure was built around the fact that the British did not have to greatly worry about what was happening in Europe during the 1920s, but this would decisively change during the 1930s. This made the British far less likely to support just a straight continuation of the agreements made both in 1921 and 1930, with even the 5-5-3 ratio, which had taken so much time and effort to get to, being seen as the bare minimum at the time and perhaps unacceptable in the 1930s. In this episode, we will discuss the final collapse of the treaty, which the Royal Navy had started planning for years in advance. Then we will look at some of the concrete plans and actions that the Royal Navy would start the moment that the Japanese withdrew from the treaty restrictions. We will only talk about the modernization efforts that resulted from these plans today, before diving into the planning and construction of the King George V class next episode, at which point we will look at all the other British pre-war battleship designs as well. In retrospect, the planning and discussions around the end of the treaty would be incredibly important to the British war efforts after 1939. They would of course not know this in 1936, but very few of the capital ships that would be started in 1937 and later would actually be complete in September 1939, and very few of the capital ships would be completed during the war either. And this made the choices made in 1936 around how to spend the budget, which ships to modernize, and what designs they wanted to build in 1936 around capital ships, some of the most important that the Royal Navy would make during the interwar years, even if they did not fully understand how important they were at the time. One thing I also wanted to mention at the start of this episode was the state of the Royal Navy at this point in time, just looking at the numbers. It can be tempting, and I have certainly fallen into this a bit myself in these episodes, to paint the Royal Navy as some sort of huge underdog, or a navy that was behind the times during the 1930s. However, by the mid-30s, and really all the way up to the start of the war, the Royal Navy was incredibly strong, even in comparison to every other navy in the world. Before other navies began their final pre-war ships, the Royal Navy had 3 of the strongest naval vessels afloat in the Nelson, Rodney, and Hood. All 3 were certainly showing their age, but so was every other capital ship around the world that had been allowed to exist as part of the Washington Treaty. This is easy to forget because all 3 of these ships would not receive pre-war modernizations, even though they were all planned to receive them starting in 1940. They did not compare well to the new ships of the late 1930s, but that is an unfair comparison. The Royal Navy was also roughly at parity with other navies for aircraft carriers, with the Ark Royal being the first purpose-built Royal Navy carrier, which was launched the same year as the American carrier, Yorktown. The Royal Navy had spent and would continue to spend a lot of money on destroyers and cruisers, which would give them one of the largest and youngest fleets of small ships in the world when the war began. Also, for the Americans out there, the British would have to help the Americans on anti-submarine patrols off the US East Coast after they entered the war. That's how much better prepared they were for the war when it started. There were two reasons for this. The first was that they had many responsibilities all over the world, which had a tendency to spread the available strength very thin. It made them seem weaker, and it forced them into confrontation with multiple other navies simultaneously. They also end up getting compared to the American and Japanese navies of 1941, both of which had over 2 years of relative peace to continue to build their navies, while all major construction for the Royal Navy essentially ended in 1939 and early 1940, while resources were needed elsewhere. Again, they continued to build smaller ships, but we're talking about the largest ships, the capital ships, the battleships, the aircraft carriers. Most of those, or all of those, were put on hold. I don't necessarily have a grand point in sort of bringing this up during this episode, but I thought it was good to kind of reset expectations and mindsets before we continue. Looking back at our previous episodes and all the members' episodes, sort of where I've talked about the Royal Navy, I'm concerned that maybe I leaned in too much into this kind of underdog, scrappy, small Navy sort of feel with the Royal Navy, and that's absolutely not what they were during the 1930s. But with that out of the way, let's talk about why the Japanese were so unhappy with the treaty system in the mid-1930s and why they wanted out. While the treaty would expire in 1936, it was actually dead in 1934. This was because in May 1934, the Japanese would announce their belief that the agreements that had been made in London in 1930 required massive revision, specifically related to Japan being forced into a second-rate position. The Japanese would also insist that any discussions that they had with other powers would only involve naval topics, which clearly signaled that they were not open to discussing events in China or including discussions of those events in any part of naval talks. While the Japanese would signal that parity was the overall most important thing they wanted out of any further naval talks, for the British delegation, they would push for qualitative changes, which was the origin of the push for 25,000 tons and 12-inch guns. From the British perspective, any revision of the capital ship ratios was completely off the table and would not even be discussed. The British and Americans would get together in June 1934 before involving the Japanese in further discussions. During this meeting about their respective plans for the conference, while they disagreed on many specific details, they would both agree that the most important piece of any future discussions was that the ratio provided to the Japanese should not be revised. They both agreed to not make any agreements with the Japanese about the ratio without the other nation being involved. At the same time, the British and Japanese were also having discussions, particularly around timing, with the British wanting to begin the official conference in January 1935, while the British wanted to wait until later in the year. All kinds of other unilateral decisions and discussions would also occur during this period, with the British meeting with the French, in which the French would emphasize how important submarines were to their naval plans, while also making it clear that they were likely to agree with pretty much anything as long as their parity was maintained with the Italians. The Italians would then also meet and announce to the British that they were quite set on building 2 new 35,000-ton battleships, which were allowed to them under existing naval agreements to bring up to their sort of allowed tonnage, but also because all their other ships were so old. The French then insisted that they would also be building 2 such ships to match the Italians. These building programs basically ended any British hopes of smaller ship limits. Nobody was going to want to build smaller ships after these new 35,000-ton ships started to be laid down by European powers. However, there was overall less insistence on any ratio changes among European powers, with the French and Italians not really pushing for ratio changes as long as the other was not allowed to build more than them. These views would clash with the Japanese insistence on change, and during discussions in late 1934, the Japanese would not budge from this position. This caused deadlock at the conference, with the British only wanting to discuss qualitative limitation changes, so smaller capital ships, the Japanese only wanting to discuss quantitative changes, and the Americans not really pushing forward with either of those. The Japanese were also not the only nation causing problems. The British would not really help themselves at the conference with the signing of the Anglo-German Naval Treaty in 1935, which caused other nations, and especially France and Italy, to be very displeased that the British would sign something without informing them of the changes. Eventually, Japan would inform the other nations that it would officially refuse to sign any further extension of the treaties, which meant that the agreements between Japan and the other nations would end at their expiration date in 1936. To be absolutely fair to the Japanese, they did all this completely by the book, and they exited the treaty in precisely the way that they could and should, which was outlined all the way back in 1921 at the Washington Naval Treaty. Nobody was obligated to sign an extension, and they didn't. Even with their stated refusal, there would still be a London Naval Conference, which would begin in December 1935. Most of the major naval powers were involved, and Japan even sent a delegation, if only to kind of keep tabs on what was happening. There were also discussions of including the Germans and the Soviet Union to make up for the withdrawal of the Japanese. The French effectively vetoed both of these additions, though, just straight up refusing to have any discussions with German representatives, as they saw such discussions as a tacit acceptance of Versailles revisionism, which they would never do. They also rejected the inclusion of the Soviet Union out of concern that it would antagonize the Japanese. The eventual agreement in London on March 25, 1936, would still include some qualitative limits, with 35,000 tons and 14-inch guns for battleships being the headline items. But critically, it would also include an escalator clause that allowed for the usage of 16-inch guns if one of the Washington Naval Treaty signatories refused to sign the new agreement, which essentially assured it because the Japanese were not interested. This escalator clause was insisted on by the Americans, who went into the conference strongly preferring 16-inch gun limitations. When it was clear that many other nations were at least accepting or even preferred the 14-inch limit, the Americans agreed to it with the addition of the clause. It was a near certainty that the Japanese would not sign the agreement, which meant that it was very likely that the escalator clause would be activated. This was an interesting moment where the design thoughts from the American and Royal Navies came into conflict. The two navies had very different designs for a 35,000-ton battleship, with the British strongly preferring greater armor. This meant that they did not actually believe that the best 35,000-ton ship could even mount 16-inch guns, and in fact 16-inch guns should only be included on ships of at least 40,000 tons. The Americans put less emphasis on armor and therefore believed that they could build the ship that they wanted, with 16-inch guns, within a 35,000-ton limit. While the outcome of the conference was a failure for the Royal Navy, at least when it came to getting what they wanted, especially around qualitative limits, at the very least it was a perfect example of the kind of growing Anglo-American cooperation. The overall feelings in 1930 were relatively antagonistic between the two navies, but by 1936, all of the discussions and decisions that had been made before and during the conference between the two navies had brought them much closer together, which would be a very positive development, as it would turn out. This episode of History of the Second World War is sponsored by Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing, so your money has a chance to grow for you, your kids, and your retirement. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. You don't need to be rich. Acorns lets you invest with the spare money you've got right now. You can start with $5 or even just your spare change. It is, after all, a new year, and Acorns is a New Year's resolution that's easy to keep. It only takes about 5 minutes to open an account and to start automatically saving and investing your money so that it has a chance to grow. And the best part is that after you sign up, it can all happen automatically. So head over to acorns.com/SWWpod or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Paid client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC and SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/SWWpod.
There are really many reasons to listen to our podcast, Big Picture Science. It's kind of a challenge to summarize them all, Molly.
Okay, here's a reason to listen to our show, Big Picture Science, because you love to be surprised by science news. We love to be surprised by science news. So, for instance, I learned on our own show that I had been driving around with precious metals in my truck before it was stolen.
That was brought up in our show about precious metals and also rare metals, like most of the things in your catalytic converter. I was surprised to learn that we may begin naming heat waves like we do hurricanes. You know, prepare yourself for heat wave Lucifer.
I don't think I can prepare myself for that.
Look, we like surprising our listeners. We like surprising ourselves by reporting new developments in science and while asking the big picture questions about why they matter and how they will affect our lives today and in the future.
Well, we can't affect lives in the past, right?
Oh, I guess that's a point. So the podcast is called Big Picture Science, and you can hear it wherever you get your podcasts.
We are the hosts. Seth is a scientist. I'm a science journalist, and we talk to people smarter than us. We hope you'll take a listen.
As we discussed on an earlier episode, early in 1936, the Royal Navy would fully reevaluate the plans that it had for a new building program, which seemed destined to start in the near future. With the clear disintegration of the treaty agreements, and most importantly, it becoming less and less likely that the British plans for displacement reductions would gain acceptance, the plans for the 35,000-ton designs would have to begin to be refined. At this time, there were also discussions around what it would take to rapidly accelerate those building plans should it be required. This would result in the Supplementary Estimate of 1936, which would be based around the idea of bringing 3 battleships that had been originally planned for 1937 to instead be laid down in late 1936. Recruiting was also a critical aspect of this expansion program. It was very clear that if the Navy wanted to grow as much as it was planning, the number of men in the service would have to begin quite rapidly to expand. This meant an increase of almost 30%, up to at least 130,000 by 1940. This was no small amount of change, especially financially. If you remember our last episode, during the 1920s and 1930s, sort of the manpower in the Navy was such an important aspect of naval budgets, with constant pressure to reduce because it reduced cost. And now that was no longer going to happen. All of these discussions around growth and the acceleration of that growth only grew more urgent as many other nations began to publicly announce their building programs, which was required under the Washington Naval Treaty System. And the Anglo-German Treaty of 1935 also included that clause. During 1936, the Germans would start construction of another battleship, which would eventually be the Tirpitz. The French had started the ships that would eventually be the Richelieu and Jean Bart. Italy would join the others in constructing a whole host of small cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. There are reports that the Russians were also planning on 2 16-inch armed battleships as well. Meanwhile, in America, the first Vinson Act had been started with the goal of building up the American Navy to its treaty-authorized limit, which during the 1930s it had not really been keeping up with. During 1936, the Americans would only start on a small number of ships, destroyers, submarines, but in early 1937, there would be discussions about really boosting that construction rate. Japan would also start seeing fruits of their first and second replenishment programs, which had been started during the previous years, designed to massively expand all of their armed forces, including the Navy. All of these new building programs would put the Royal Navy in a bit of a bind, because the conclusion of their new design program had been that a 14-inch gun was the way to go for the next set of battleships. But as every other nation started building 15 and 16-inch armed ships, the Royal Navy would decide to stick with their previous decision. However, this was driven just as much by fears of delay more than any other reason. Admiral Henderson, at the time the controller of the Navy, believed that a shift to a 15-inch gun would require roughly 18 months of delay, and the ship would have to be made significantly larger if they wanted to go all the way up to 16-inch guns. With these issues in mind, the previous decision of 14-inch guns would be maintained, with the understanding that it would need to be changed after 1937. Along with the new construction, there was being planned modernization efforts, which were seen as critical. The idea of large and costly modernizations of pre-treaty capital ships was an idea that had really started to gain traction after about 1930. It was in the treaty that was signed in 1930, with the extension of the ban on capital ship constructions out to 1937, that many navies started to seriously consider some level of updates on capital ships that had been allowed to exist under the Washington Naval Treaty, so ones that had been built before 1921, so really old ships. Many of these ships were even pre-World War I vintage, or at the very least had been completed during or immediately after the war. And then by the time that the treaty was due to expire, they would be over 20 years old. This was very problematic when it came time to think about the prospects of these ships in the face of the new construction that was happening around the world. The British were actually quite late to the game when it came to these modernization efforts. By 1933, the United States had already gone through a modernization cycle on many of its Washington-allowed capital ships, and both the United States and Japan would go on to spend quite a bit more on those efforts as the years continued. The Royal Navy was a bit slower on the uptake, primarily for budgetary reasons, with each modernization effort planning to cost, roughly £3 million. The overall goal of these efforts was to extend the life of the ships into the 1940s, at which point it was planned that they would be fully replaced with new construction. The plan as of 1931 was to have the Royal Sovereigns be replaced by 1942, the Queen Elizabeths by 1944, the Repulse and Renown by 1945, and the Hood, Rodney, and Nelson between 1946 and 1948. This meant that the modernization efforts were really only designed to extend the life of the ships by 5 to 7 years, and the Admiralty would go to great pains to make it clear, and then to re-emphasize many times, over and over again, that such modernization efforts should not be seen as a substitute for new warship construction. They were instead simply to bridge the gap until enough new ships could be completed. During the mid-1920s, many of the British capital ships that had survived Washington had gone through a small modernization program. There were serious budgetary constraints on these efforts in the 1920s, though, and so decisions had been made about how best to spend money. This is where you get the torpedo protection on the Queen Elizabeth class, which was chosen over something like increasing its protection from air attack. Or, as the Admiralty Subcommittee on the matter would say, quote, "At present, underwater protection is more important than deck protection, though the position of the future may be reversed if there are any great developments in bomb dropping from airplanes." That was the Admiralty in 1920, and obviously by the late 1930s, there had been great developments in bomb dropping from airplanes. When it came time for the 1930 modernization efforts, the threat from the air would be reevaluated and was judged to be far more concerning and worth a greater investment into both anti-aircraft weaponry and armor against air attacks. The armament additions had actually been ongoing since around 1933 as weapons became available, because it was far easier to just add some anti-aircraft weapons, and it had been and was done any time ships were brought into port for major maintenance. This included not just more anti-aircraft guns, but also new and more capable high-angle fire directors, which would make all the anti-aircraft guns more effective. This process of adding additional anti-aircraft weapons and capabilities would be accelerated after 1936 as the threat of war in Europe began to increase. It would also not really end until the end of the Second World War, and if you read about any capital ship going into port during the war at all, they seem to always exit with more and newer anti-aircraft guns. Armor to protect from air attacks would be a bit more challenging to just increase on an ad hoc basis, though. It was quite a bit more difficult to just throw some additional armor on, and so the large 1930s modernization efforts were a perfect time to tackle this problem. This would also provide additional protection from plunging gunfire, a problem that had been growing over the decades as possible engagement ranges continued to increase. Armor was also heavy, and it was only through the costly and time-consuming re-engining efforts that were done to the Queen Elizabeth ships, for example, which essentially required an entire new set of engines, boilers, and other machinery, that the weight for additional armor could be found. But there were limits on how much new armor could be added, and so they would really have to consider what the threat was. This is where the timing of the refits and their expected lifespan comes into play. When the modernizations were being planned, which is early 30s, mid 1930s, the threat profile from aircraft was totally different. For example, a 550-pound bomb was pretty much the maximum that could be carried by carrier aircraft at the time. It was impossible to know how quickly carrier aircraft would accelerate in terms of capabilities in the late 1930s and early 1940s, but also for many of the modernized ships, the plan was to retire them by the mid-1940s anyway. Because of this planned retirement date, they did not feel that they needed to be quite as concerned about the growth of the aerial threat, as history would prove that they needed to be, given how long these ships spent in service. Warspite would be the first ship to be given the modernization improvements, which we dove into in some detail in the Warspite special. The re-engining and replacement of so much machinery resulted in massive weight savings, around 1,290 tons. And it also made that machinery smaller and far more efficient, resulting in more power while consuming less fuel. This combination of factors allowed the Warspite's range to be increased from 8,400 nautical miles to 14,300 nautical miles. New turrets were also fitted, which allowed the guns to be fired at a higher angle, increasing the maximum engagement ranges of the ship. The turret changes were directly necessitated by the newer ships that were being built by other nations, which could fire their guns at higher angles than the British ships, these older British ships, which had a 20-degree maximum elevation, which was increased to 30 degrees during modernization. All told, the Warspite would take 3 years and would cost £3 million, and then it was done with the Queen Elizabeth, and then the Valiant was planned to be third. At that point, the plan was to work on the hood, and after these large modernizations were done, the plans were a bit different. And while it was recognized that additional ships would require modernization efforts, it was unclear as to how extensive they would be. Again, we're talking about 1941, 1942 timeframe. The reason that there was some ambiguity about these plans is that the retirement dates were approaching for the rest of the Queen Elizabeths, the Renown, the Repulse, the Nelson, Rodney, and Hood. So they were in kind of a different position. Their modernizations would be to just last a few years instead of almost a decade. And so whatever extent they would be was not precisely determined, and they just assumed, or the Royal Navy would assume, that they would have to figure those out later once they sort of took them in hand. Of course, those later years never came, because the war started, and modernization efforts were ended soon after the declaration of war, with the Hood never being taken in hand, if only because it, along with every other ship, now had a job to do. It's amazing the kind of difference in performance the ships that had these modernization efforts and didn't had during the war. And essentially all theaters, if you look at a lot of the ships that were leftovers from the pre-treaty era, and those that were modernized and those that were not modernized, they're entirely different ships, essentially. Again, we talked about this during the Warspite special quite a bit, how even ships of the same class, Warspite's sister ships of the same class, were almost useless compared to these new modernized ships. Thank you for listening again today. Next episode, on the next members episode anyway, we will dive into the construction of the King George V class, which would be so important to the Royal Navy after 1939.